Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Holyoake Lecture, to all our guests tonight. It's great to be back here in person. I'm Liam Whitton, Director of Communications and Development at Humanist UK, and it's my job tonight to detain you very briefly to speak a little about Humanist UK and the Holyoake Lecture before I introduce our speaker, Kenan Malik. It's great to be here in person, back at the Friends Meeting House, where we've held this lecture. Every year we've been in person since 2016. This is our small p political lecture in Humanist UK's series of lectures, and it explores aspects of politics or contemporary social issues as relate to secularism and humanism, and particularly issues like liberalism, democracy, social justice, feminism, anti-racism, LGBT rights, or equality. And the Holyoake medalist, who presents the lecture, has made a significant contribution in one of these fields. The lecture and the medal are named after the 19th century humanist George Jacob Holyoake, who, among many other achievements, coined the term secularism, and was also a significant political activist who founded the cooperative movement. And it's hosted in Manchester, this lecture, every year in association with Humanist UK's partner group, the Greater Manchester Humanists. You'll have seen some of their committee outside promoting next year's lectures here in Manchester. Now, since 2016, most Holyoake lecturers have chosen to speak under the title Towards a Humanist Politics, sometimes with a subtitle, sometimes not. And in that time, we've heard from Owen Jones, and then the very next year we heard from Douglas Murray, we've heard from Joan Bakewell, and in 2019, Robert Peston was our lecturer, and he received the Holyoake Medal for the talk on mending a fractured society. And last year we were online, COVID, and we heard from Dr. Laura Schwartz on the topic of infidel feminism, secularism, and women's rights, past and present. Tonight we're looking at a different issue in the humanist fight for freedom and equality. I'm delighted to be introducing Kenan Malik to take us through it. Kenan is a writer, a lecturer, and a broadcaster, and a columnist for The Observer. He's a former panellist on the Moral Maze, and he's presented BBC Three's Night Waves and Radio 4's Analysis. His previous books include The Quest for a Moral Compass and From Fatwa to Jihad, and which was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. I won't detain you any longer. Kenan Malik.
Thanks, Ian. It's a pleasure and an honour to be here. To be back in Manchester, actually. I grew up in Manchester, but that was so long ago I can barely remember it. So my thanks to Humanist UK, to Ian and to Andrew, who's not here, for inviting me to give this talk. Let me begin with a quote from Frantz Fanon. You might know the great Martinique-born revolutionary intellectual, from his book Black Skins, White Masks. The Negro is not any more than the white man. Fanon was making an argument about the illusory character of racial categorization, of the falsity of defining people by the racial boxes into which they are put. And yet, more than 70 years after Fanon wrote those lines, they still feel unsettling, as if they're a challenge to our being as much as to the process of racialization. That they should do so exposes the deeply conflicted relationship we still have with race. We live in an age in which most societies there is a moral abhorrence of racism, albeit that in most, bigotry and discrimination still disfigure the lives of many. We also live in an age in which our thinking is saturated with racial ideology and the embrace of difference. The more we despise racial thinking, the more we seem to cling to it. It's that paradox that I want to address tonight. For some, there is no paradox. What we now call the politics of identity is seen by many as essential in any challenge to racism. That too is what I want to address tonight and to question. I want to show that the concept of race was the first form of identity politics, and that contemporary identity politics reprises much racial thinking. And to make my case, I want to retell the story, both of the idea of race and of the struggles to confront racism and to transcend racial categorization. And in retelling that story, I will also challenge many of the ways in which we think both of race and of racism. Race is a modern concept. That's not to say prejudices or the categorization of distinct human groups were not deeply rooted in the pre-modern world. On the contrary, notions of difference and inequality were integral to the pre-modern consciousness. Paradoxically, that's why such prejudices are a long way from racial ideas in a modern sense. Only in a world in which the principles of social equality and a common humanity had become widely accepted could ideas of inequality and racial difference gain meaning. And that was the world that was slowly coming to being in 18th century Europe, in particular through the Enlightenment. There is perhaps no period of history that has been more analysed, debated, celebrated and disparaged than the Enlightenment. For some, it is the foundation of Western thought, of science and rationalism, of modern ideas of liberty, equality and tolerance. For others, it is a source of racism and bigotry, whose ideas of equality and tolerance were, in the words of the late philosopher Charles Mill, never meant to be extended outside the European population, and that for Enlightenment thinkers, non-whites were limited to sub-person status. The Enlightenment was not, however, a singular blob with a single set of views and ideals. It was deeply riven with differences and debates. At the same time, ideas of race derived not just from a set of ideas, but also from material reality and social practices. It is both the contradictions within the Enlightenment and the tension between abstract ideals and social practices that gives rise to the paradox of modernity as the source both of modern ideas of equality and of ideas of race. For all the debates and disagreements among 18th century philosophers, there were several themes which, while often fiercely contested, provided a thread through the Enlightenment. The two most important were the moral significance of equality and of a common human nature. It is universally acknowledged, David Hume wrote, that there is a great uniformity among acts of men in all nations and all ages, and that human nature remains the same in its principles and operations. Linked to the belief in a common human nature was the idea of equality, to treat all mankind without reference to religion, nation or colour as one fraternity, one great community, as the Prussian philosopher and diplomat Wilhelm von Humboldt put it. And yet, this was also the age of slavery and colonialism. Many Enlightenment philosophers combined the defence of liberty and equality with racist attitudes and an acceptance of slavery. Hume argued that human nature remains the same in its principles and operations, but also that I am apt to suspect that Negroes are naturally inferior to the whites. Thomas Jefferson helped write the American Declaration of Independence, which opens with that celebrated line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." He was also a slave owner. Immanuel Kant published three major works between 1775 and 1788, in which he argued that humanity comprised four races, distinguished primarily by skin colour. Humanity, he believed, has its greatest degree of perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a somewhat lesser talent. The Negroes are much lower, and the lowest of all, the American peoples, by which he meant Native Americans, of course. What we're seeing here is the beginnings of a contradiction that would shape social consciousness in the modern world. The contradiction between an abstract belief in equality and the reality of a deeply unequal world. Race came to be the way of making sense of that contradiction. Emerging capitalist societies had destroyed many old divisions, but had created new ruptures, not simply between Europeans and non-European peoples, but also fault lines of class, rank and status within European societies themselves. These divisions would have seemed unremarkable in the pre-modern world, but it posed a fundamental problem in a new world built around the idea that all men are created equal. Despite such a bold declaration, the social inequalities of the new world seemed as permanent as those of the old. Over time, they came to be seen as unmovable, as natural, as racial. There's a common assumption that many people hold that racism emerges when members of one race begin discriminating against members of another. That racism is what develops when races collide. In fact, I want to show the opposite is the case. Race did not give birth to racism. Racism gave birth to race. The ancestors of today's African Americans were not enslaved because they were black. They became classified as a distinct and inferior race as a means eventually of justifying their enslavement. Race was not a concept that was consciously forged to explain away enslavement or social inequalities. Rather, its social divisions acquired the status of permanence, so differences presented themselves as if they were natural, not social. Racial ideology was the inevitable product of the persistence of differences of rank, class, and peoples in a society that had accepted the concept of equality. It was in the 18th century that early forms of these tensions began playing out. By the end of that century, the concept of race had found a foothold in European intellectual circles, and the classification of human racial types had begun. Yet for all this, racial thinking remained marginal. Those who proposed racial explanations did so with a handful of exceptions, sotto voce. A key reason was the significance of equality as a defining feature of Enlightenment thought. And if the arguments of Hume, Jefferson, and Kant represent one strand of thinking about race, the beliefs of a figure like the French philosopher Denis Diderot represented a very different strand. Diderot was hostile to slavery and colonialism. He dismissed the idea that non-humans were savages because their forms of governance, religion, and moral norms were different to those of Europe. After listing all the horrors that the Spanish conquistadors had imposed on the peoples of the Americas, Diderot asks, "Tell me, reader, do you see here civilized people arriving among savages, or savages received by civilized peoples?" In the contrast between the views of Hume and Jefferson and Kant and those of someone like Diderot lies the distinction between what we now call the mainstream or moderate Enlightenment on the one hand, and on the other, the radical Enlightenment. The mainstream Enlightenment consisted of the figures with which most of us are familiar, about whom most historians have written, not just Kant, Hume, and Jefferson, but Locke and Voltaire, Adam Smith, and Benjamin Franklin. It was, however, the radical Enlightenment, shaped by lesser known figures like Diderot, D'Holbach, and Spinoza, that truly gave substance to the arguments about equality and emancipation. The struggle between the mainstream and the radicals was key in shaping the character of the Enlightenment, and also in framing subsequent debates about race and colonialism. In the 19th century, for instance, it often took the form of a debate between liberal and radical universalists about what it meant to be universalist, or what universalism meant. The liberal universalists often helped nurture racial concepts and supported colonialism. The radicals were hostile to both. Someone like John Stuart Mill, the great liberal philosopher of the Victorian era, whose book On Liberty remains one of the foundational works of liberalism. He was a staunch abolitionist, an opponent of hardline racism. He was also an advocate of colonialism. Mill believed, like all classical liberals, that the individual is sovereign over his own mind and body, and that such sovereignty could only be curtailed to prevent harm to others, the classic liberal viewpoint. This doctrine, however, applied, according to Mill, neither to children nor to those whom he considered to be childish peoples. Despotism, he wrote, is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians. In the wake of the so-called Indian Mutiny of 1857, in reality, an independence insurrection, the first independence insurrection, Mill defended the rule of the East India Company. The Chartist People's Paper, on the other hand, in the spirit of the radical Enlightenment, insisted that the revolt of Hindustan was no different to struggles for freedom by European peoples. Many Britons had supported Poles in their conflict with Russia. They should equally, he insisted, support the struggle of Indians against the British. Another radical paper, the Beehive, similarly defended Jamaican workers against the tyranny of British rule. Those of our countrymen who, in any dispute between black and white, confine their fellow feeling to that side where they find complexions like their own, it observed, are not to be trusted. As well as the battle between liberals and radicals over the meaning of universalism, there was also in the post-Enlightenment world a challenge to the very idea of universalism. Perhaps the most important figure in developing the anti-universalist argument was the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder. Born in 1744, he became a seminal figure straddling the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment world. He was as committed to social equality as any Enlightenment radical, being a vociferous critic of colonialism, slavery, and racial concepts. The ambiguity of his philosophy opened the way, however, to both racist and anti-racist thinking. The fundamental unit of human existence was, for Herder, the folk. This is usually translated as the people, but has a deeper, more spiritual connotation. And what made each folk unique was its particular language, literature, culture, and modes of living. That unique nature was articulated to the Volksgeist, the spirit of a people, refined through history. These ideas came to be at the heart of the romantic, conservative idea of culture and belonging, and still shape much of our thinking about culture and communities today. Despite his attachment to equality, Herder's cultural relativism and his celebration of the authenticity and singularity of cultures led him to deeply repulsive, indeed racist views. He abhorred migration and mixed marriages, which he said were strongly detrimental to the beauty or uniqueness of a people. He wrote of Africans that nature had been obliged to deny them nobler gifts such as a finer intellect, which the creature whose breast swells with the boiling passions beneath this burning sun must necessarily be refused. In the 20th century, Herder's pluralism and his celebration of cultural difference became, as we shall see, the root of much anti-racist thinking and the often unacknowledged foundation of identity politics. In the 19th century, Herder's ideas flowed also into racial thinking. Once it was accepted that different peoples were motivated by different sentiments, unique to themselves, that these sentiments were inexpressibly imbued in a people's history, tradition, and consciousness, and defined every individual's being, it was not a great step to view these sentiments as racial. Over time, Herder's Volksgeist became transformed into racial type. And that ambiguity remains a feature of many strands of contemporary anti-racism, as we shall see. The fading of the radical tradition, the triumph of a liberal form of universalism, the embrace of Herderian views of culture, and the entrenchment of social divisions all helped open up the space for racial thinking. By the second half of the 19th century, the naturalization of social relations and social division had acquired both the stamp of scientific truth and the status of common sense. The concept of a racial type, as it developed through the 19th century, was of a group of people linked by a set of fundamental characteristics and differing from other types by virtue of those attributes. These included not just mental and physical traits, but also social needs, aspirations, and value. One's being, one's identity, determined one's moral and social place in the world. Here, before the phrase was coined, was the original politics of identity. It was embodied in the idea of race. Today we think about race in terms of skin colour or continent of origin, black, white, Asian, and so on. But that was not how racial distinctions were viewed in the 19th century. Race was not just a question of skin colour, but primarily of social differences. It may be difficult to comprehend now, but 19th century thinkers saw the working class as racially distinct in the same way as many now view black people as being racially distinct from whites. In 1865, a banquet was held in Southampton in honour of Edward John Eyre, the governor of Jamaica. That year, Eyre had put down an uprising on the island with the utmost ferocity, and his actions divided opinion at home. The Daily Telegraph, reporting on a protest outside the banquet, wrote that there are a good many Negroes in Southampton who have the taste of their tribe for any disturbance that appears safe. In fact, as the historian Douglas Lorimer observes, the Daily Telegraph's Negroes were the very English and very white Southampton mob who thronged the streets outside the banquet hall. The description of the protesters as Negroes was no slip of the pen, though. For the Victorian elites, the working class was as racially distinct from the middle class as blacks from whites, while also possessing many of the same traits as blacks. It was a vignette of working class life in the London newspaper The Saturday Review in 1864, which described the Bethnal Green poor as a race of whom we know nothing, adding that distinctions and separations, like those of English classes, offer a very fair parallel to the separation of the slaves from the whites. While the working class was seen as racially inferior, black people were often afforded greater respect than commonly imagined, because race in the 19th century was an expression of social distinctions rather than simply of colour differences. Non-whites, regarded as possessing high social status, were treated with more deference than lower-class whites. When Arthur Hamilton Gordon was made governor of Fiji in 1874, he insisted that Fijian slaves were his equals, possessed as they were of undoubted aristocracy, as he put it. "Nurse can't understand it all," Lady Gordon observed with amused condescension in her diary. "She looks down on them as an inferior race. I don't like to tell her that these ladies are my equal, which she is not." In the second half of the 19th century, however, as racial arguments became more entrenched, commentators became more sceptical about black people aspiring to high social status. All blacks of whatever class came to be seen as inferior. This did not mean that the working class was now seen as white. As black people were consigned to the lower classes, the working class at home became viewed through a colonial lens. As there is a darkest Africa, there is also a darkest England, wrote William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, in his 1890 book, In Darkest England, describing Henry Morton Stanley's travels in equatorial Africa, which had made headlines that year. Booth wrote that within a stone's stone's throw of our cathedrals and palaces, similar horrors to which Stanley has found existing in the great equatorial forest exist here too. Meanwhile, sociologists developed the argument that class divisions were in reality race divisions. Ludwig Gomplowicz, who's an important sociologist in the late 19th century, he thought that early human societies were confronted with a question, who was to work for whom? The answer was settled through a struggle of the races, which imposed a division of labour in which inferior and difficult tasks fell to the dominated, while the superior and easier occupations became the prerogative of the dominant. Lester Ward, the first president of the American Sociological Association, drew on the work of Gomplowicz to emphasise how the genesis of society has been through the struggle of races. The conquering race looks down with contempt upon the conquered race and compels it to serve it in various ways. Here, for Ward, lay the origins of social class. Not just the working class, but as many know, many populations now seen as white were certainly not viewed that way 150 years ago. The Irish, Jews, Slavs, Southern Europeans were all seen as distinct races and often as non-white. Race in the contemporary sense and whiteness as we understand it emerged only in the early decades of the 20th century, propelled by two developments: the coming of democracy and a new imperialism exemplified by the scramble for Africa. As Western nations became more democratic, with the eventual extension of suffrage to the whole adult population, so the racial view of the working class, which had dominated 19th century elite consciousness, slowly faded from public view. The widening of suffrage coincided with the expansion of imperial rule in a frenzy of land grabbing by European nations from Africa to the Pacific. In a coincidence of democracy and imperialism, racial thinking evolved from being an elite ideology to becoming part of popular culture. The language of race became refocused more exclusively on skin colour, and whiteness was extended to all classes and most Europeans. That we still view race in this fashion should not blind us to the fact that it has not always been so, and that our perception of race, then and now, is a product of social negotiation and conflict. If much of the history of race has been forgotten, so too has much of the history of the challenge to racism. Until relatively recently, radicals challenging inequality and oppression did so in the name not of particular identities, but of universal rights. They insisted that equal rights belonged to all, and that there existed a set of values and institutions under which all humans best flourished. It was a universalism that fueled the great radical movements that have shaped the modern world, from anti-colonial struggles to the movement for women's suffrage to the battle for gay rights. That universalism was perhaps best expressed in the Haitian Revolution of 1791. It's one of the three great revolutions of the 18th century, but one which, when compared to the place that the American and French revolutions occupied our culture, is barely remembered. Yet, it was through the Haitian Revolution, in which the slaves of the French colony of Saint-Domingue dismantled their change and declared an independent nation, that the emancipatory logic of Enlightenment universalism was for the first time seen through to its conclusions. In the debate about the Enlightenment, supporters and critics both present it as a peculiarly European phenomenon. For the one, it is the demonstration of the greatness of Europe. For the other, a reminder that its ideals are tainted by racism and colonialism. Both miss the importance of the non-European world, in shaping many of the ideals we now associate with the Enlightenment. It was through the struggles of those denied equality and liberty by the elites in Europe and America that ideas of universalism were invested with meaning. And it is the demise of that radical universalist tradition that has shaped so much of what we now call identity politics. No single event more profoundly revealed both the necessity for and the shortcomings of the Enlightenment than the Haitian Revolution. The French revolutionaries overthrew the old regime in 1789 in the name of the rights of man. But those rights did not apply to the colonies. Very specifically, the National Assembly in Paris decreed that the Declaration of Rights of Man did not apply to any French colony, ensuring, as the historian Laurent Dubois sardonically notes, that the colonies were safe from the dangers of universalism. They had not reckoned with the insurgents of Saint-Domingue, beginning as a struggle to enforce reforms to the slave system. The insurrection, under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, a self-educated former slave, turned in the course of a 12-year-long rebellion into a demand for emancipation and eventually for national self-determination. In August 1793, the new French commissioner on Saint-Domingue outlawed slavery, realizing that the only way to save the colony, which had been invaded by both Spanish and French forces, was with the support of the rebel armies. 6 months later, France officially abolished slavery in all French territories. Without the slave insurrection, Laurent Dubois observes, the French Revolution would probably have run its course like the American Revolution, without destroying the massive violation of human rights at the heart of the nation's existence. The slaves of Saint-Domingue had forced the French revolutionists to take seriously their own revolutionary ideals. Early historians of the Haitian Revolution, such as C.L.R. James, who I'll come on to in a minute, in his groundbreaking work, The Black Jacobins, placed much emphasis on the French Revolution and the Declaration of Rights of Man in shaping the attitudes of slave insurgents. More recent accounts have downplayed or ignored that revolutionary ideology, stressing instead factors such as religion and the African cultures from which the slaves had been snatched. This contrast reflects in part the accumulation of new research. It reflects also the broader aims of historians and the changing relationship of radicals to the Enlightenment. C.L.R. James published The Black Jacobins in 1938 in a period of intense anti-colonial struggles when radicals still looked to Enlightenment ideals as the foundation of progressive movements. In the decades that followed, disenchantment with the Enlightenment became more deeply entrenched and a defining feature of many strands of radicalism. One reason for such disenchantment was the contradiction between Enlightenment ideals and the reality of racism and colonialism. If Europe was responsible for the subjugation of more than half the world, many asked, what worth could there be in its political and moral ideals, which at best had failed to prevent that subjugation, at worst had provided its intellectual grounding? Did not those challenging European imperialism also need to challenge European ideas? Such ideas, the critics argued, were tainted because they were a means of effecting European power. Non-Europeans had to develop their own ideas, beliefs and values rooted in their own cultures and histories. These arguments would lay the ground for those challenging injustice and oppression to cleave to what we now call identity politics. From the earliest days of resistance to racism and colonialism, there were movements rooted in a racial or identitarian viewpoint, from 19th century Back to Africa campaigns, to Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, to Pan-Africanism, to negritude, a largely francophone assertion of black consciousness. The ideas that guided these movements were often deeply reactionary Garvey, like many black nationalists, opposed race mixing. He regarded the Ku Klux Klan as better friends of the race than any other whites and claimed we were the first fascists. Leopold Senghor, one of the founders of negritude, thought black and white forms of thinking distinct. European reasoning is analytical, discursive, he wrote. Negro African reasoning is intuitive. It was a racialized view of cognition and values that played on racist tropes about blacks being intuitive and whites rational. And yet the relationship between universalist and identitarian views could be more complex. Take the case of C.L.R. James. Born in Trinidad in 1901, James is one of those towering figures of the 20th century who, like the revolution he so eloquently depicted, is all too rarely recognized as such. Novelist and orator, philosopher and cricketer, historian and revolutionary, there are few modern figures who can match his intellectual depth, cultural breadth, or sheer political contrariness. In the 1930s, James discovered Trotskyism, beginning a decades-long fraught but profound engagement with Marxism. He also became a key leader of the Pan-Africanist movement. Trotskyism and Pan-Africanism may not seem the most compatible of bedfellows, the one viewing social relations through the prism of class, the other defining solidarity in racial terms. James himself was clear where he stood on this issue. The race question, he wrote, is subsidiary to the class question in politics, and to think of imperialism in terms of race is disastrous. So why was James drawn to Pan-Africanism? Pan-Africanism in the 1930s stitched together two distinct political outlooks. For the essentialists, there was an unbreakable thread running through history which brought together the needs of the peoples of Africa. For the anti-capitalists, Pan-Africanism only had meaning in the struggles against imperialism and oppression, struggles defined as much by class as by race, and which could pit African against African as much as black against white. It was a distinction between those who drew on Herder's philosophy and those who were inspired by Louverture's actions. In the 1930s, the strength of working class movements and anti-imperialist struggles allowed Herder to live with Louverture. Over time, the tensions between those two worldviews became less resolvable. Two developments are important in fueling this process in a post-war world. The first was the emergence of culture rather than as race, as a lens through which discussions of human differences and similarities were refracted. In the wake of Nazism and the Holocaust, racial ideas that had dominated the pre-war world became discredited. Racism did not disappear, of course, but where ideas of racial superiority and white supremacy had been in the pre-war world not just socially acceptable but largely uncontested, within elite circles at least, now ideas of racial equality came to occupy the moral high ground. In the early 20th century, the German-American anthropologist Franz Boas and his circle of students that included such stellar names as Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict had transformed concepts of race and culture. Influenced by both German Romanticism and liberal egalitarianism, and repelled by racial science, Boas took the Herderian vision of a plurality of cultures and turned it into an anthropological concept. He developed a notion of culture functionally equivalent to that of race, except in rejecting any sense of one group being inferior or superior to another, and in which the essence of a people was rooted in history rather than in biology. Boas and his intellectual descendants helped construct a bridge over which the ghost of racial thinking was smuggled into the body of cultural pluralism in the post-war world. The emergence of culture as a medium of social discussion meshed with another key post-war development, the transformation of the working class and of the left's relationship to it. The late 1950s saw the emergence of the new left, a loose association of groups and individuals, self-consciously opposed to the old left of the communist parties and trade unions. It developed partly in response to the tyranny of Stalinism and partly also was as an embodiment of the left's growing disenchantment with both the Enlightenment and the working class. The post-war boom, the growth of living standards, the rise of consumer society, all seem to have drawn the teeth of the working class. Why should the overthrow of the existing order be of a vital necessity for people who own, or can hope to own, good clothes, a well-stocked larder, a TV set, a car, a house, and so on, all within the existing order? Asked Herbert Marcuse, who was a key member of the Marxist school of the Frankfurt School of Marxists and a guru to the 1960s student revolt. Where the old left had looked at a working class as a motor of change, the new left found new surrogate proletariats in the new social movements, Third World liberation movements, civil rights organisations, feminist groups, campaigns for gay rights, and so on. And where the old left had talked of class and sought to raise class consciousness, the new left talked of culture and sought to strengthen cultural identity. Then in the late 1970s and 1980s, an even more momentous transformation took place as the post-war order rooted in consensus politics and Keynesian economics gave way to the era of what many call neoliberalism, exemplified by the economics and social policies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. The unleashing of free market economics, the deregulation and globalization, reductions in state spending, and more individualized and unequal societies. It was the period in which the labour movement and trade unions were gravely weakened. The left lost political influence, and the new social movements themselves disintegrated. The period in which the possibilities of social transformation seemed to fade. And it was a period in which social conversations about politics and class gave way to increasingly fraught exchanges about culture and identity. Both these shifts, the replacement of race by culture and the erosion of class politics and of working class organisation, came to shape the struggle for minority rights and of radical identity politics. The struggle for black rights in America, and especially the Black Power movement, was highly influential in developing new ideas of identity and self-organisation. There was both a radical and a conservative side to 60s Black Power. The radical side was expressed through a movement such as the Black Panthers, which twinned armed self-defense of black communities with community outreach work, providing, for instance, free breakfast programs for school children, free health clinics, clothing, and so on. The organisation was eventually crushed by state repression and violence, orchestrated by the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover. It was also brought down by its own political contradictions. The dilemma with which the Panthers wrestled was how to effect social change when the agency for change seemed to be diminishing. They were open to class politics, but they also felt that racism ran so deep in American society that the possibilities of black and white solidarity were illusory. In the absence of working class solidarity, there seemed little left for the Panthers apart from, on the one hand, community action, on the other, the fantasy of armed insurrection. Panthers fragmented in the early 1970s and dismantled itself a decade later. The myth-making around radical groups such as the Panthers has helped obscure the other side of 60s Black Power, it's conservatism. For all the revolutionary bravado, much of Black Power discourse was the stuff of machine politics and the exercise of group power in a plural society. And at its heart were two deeply conservative themes. The first was an argument about group identity that can be traced back to Herder, the view of black people as a self-contained group with its own culture, values, and ways of living. The second was an argument about ethnic capitalism, a desire to replace white capitalists with black ones. In Africa, they speak of negritude, wrote Julius Leicester, a leading figure in the civil rights and black power movements. It is a recognition of all those things which are uniquely ours, which separate us from the white man. According to Leicester, the uniqueness of black culture was its emphasis on the non-verbal. It is the experience that counts, not what is said. Such claims not only drew on Herderian arguments about culture and difference, but often embraced racist tropes about African Americans as non-verbal. The poet and critic Amiri Baraka was also a founding figure, a leading figure in the black nationalist movement in the 1960s, but he shed his nationalism in the 1970s. He recognized the dangers of appropriating racial thinking, even for the cause of equal rights. He recognized, too, the importance of class in any struggle for equality. And he came to realize that simply having black faces in positions of power did little to combat racism or empower working-class blacks. The solution is not to become the enemy in blackface, as he acidly put it in his autobiography. That tendency was exacerbated by the second conservative theme in 60s black power, the celebration of black capitalism. As one delegate wrote at the first Black Power conference held in Newark, New Jersey in 1968, the general consensus is that we need to translate the economic power wielded by white men in the black ghettos of America to black men. Think about that. Not tear down the ghettos or provide decent housing and conditions, but ensure that those who controlled and profited them were not white, but blacks. Like Pan-Africanism in the 1930s, Black Power in the 1960s stitched together two distinct political outlooks, the essentialist and the anti-capitalist. Between the 30s and the 60s, anti-capitalism had become much weaker and essentialism much stronger. A shift that was to become far more pronounced over the next half century. As the political philosopher Wendy Brown has put it, what we have come to call identity politics is partly dependent on the demise of the critique of capitalism. Through these changes, the meaning of belongingness and solidarity transformed. An important distinction historically has been between that of the inward-looking binding politics of identity and the outward-looking bridging politics of solidarity. The former mobilizes by emphasizing shared membership of a particular identity, be that gender, sexuality, race, or nation. The politics of solidarity also stresses collective endeavor, but views commonality as emerging not from particular identities, but out of a shared set of values and beliefs and a struggle to win acceptance for those values and beliefs. The distinction is not always clear-cut. Elements of both exist in most social movements. It is, however, the politics of solidarity that has crumbled over the past 4 or 5 decades as radical movements have declined and the power of organised labour has drained away. For many today, the only form of collective politics that seems possible is that rooted in identity. So the frameworks through which we make sense of the world are often defined less as liberal or conservative or socialist than as white, Muslim, English or European. The rise of identity politics has transformed not just who we are and how we relate to each other, but also a conception of what racism is. The concept of white privilege has become entrenched and almost unquestioned among anti-racists and on the left. I want to question it and to suggest that it is a product not of reality, but of our obsession with identity, and an obstacle, not an aid, to the struggle against racism and racial categorization. Underlying the idea of white privilege are two basic claims. First, that white is a useful category in which to place everyone from Elon Musk to a cleaner in a Tesla factory. And secondly, that being in such a category imbues people with privileges that those not in that category do not possess. The idea that all those deemed white have a common identity and a set of interests which conflict with those of non-whites is, of course, an argument long deployed by racists. It's a claim that anti-racists would reject, recognizing that the interests of white factory workers and shelf stackers are not the same as those of white bankers or business owners, but are far closer to those of black factory workers or Asian shelf stackers. Why then do so many ignore this when it comes to the question of white privilege? Because, they argue, white people do not have to endure the discrimination suffered by non-whites by virtue of their skin colour. At one level, this is true. Racism refers to the practice of discrimination against and bigotry towards certain groups. There may be many reasons for such racism and discrimination and bigotry, but one is clearly that those who are non-white are treated unequally. Projecting this in terms of white privilege is, however, flawed. First, it is not a privilege not to have to face discrimination or bigotry. It should be the norm. To describe as privilege the fact that one is not being denied equal treatment is to turn the struggle for justice on its head. Second, the concept of white privilege fails to distinguish between not being discriminated against because of one's skin colour and having immunity from discrimination or bigotry because one is white. The distinction is important. Many whites, because of privileges afforded by wealth and class, do have immunity against discrimination. But many others who are poor and working class do not. Their experience of state authority, for instance, is often very similar to that of blacks and Asians. Consider one of the most explosive contemporary questions, disproportionate killings of African Americans by US police, the issue that led to the founding of the Black Lives Matter movement. The figures are certainly stark. Black Americans are at least twice as likely to be killed by police as whites. And yet, paradoxically, that disproportion should not be seen simply in racial terms. Studies show, unsurprisingly, that police violence is correlated with poverty. The poorer the neighbourhood, the greater the risk of an individual being killed by the police. More than half of those killed by US police are white. Someone poor and white is more likely to be killed by the police or face imprisonment than wealthy African Americans. It is true that because of racism, African Americans are disproportionately poor and working class, but that is not an argument to erase the fact that having white skin does not necessarily provide materially significant privilege, whereas being wealthy may do so even if you're black. There's a similar story with incarceration rates. America locks up more of its citizens than any other nation. And as with police killings, African Americans have disproportionately borne the brunt of the brutality. The figures are truly shocking. Black Americans are 5 times more likely to be imprisoned than white Americans. One study suggested that 1 in 3 black men born in 2001 were likely to find themselves in jail sometime during their life. These figures have led many to view mass incarceration as the new Jim Crow, most notably Michel Alexander, whose book you may have read of that title. And yet here again the issue is more complex and a product of class as much as it is of race, even more indeed than it is of race. And an analysis for the People's Project think tank in America showed that at any given income level, there is little difference between the incarceration rates of whites and blacks, but there are huge differences between between incarceration rates at different income levels. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to be in prison, whatever your race. Another study shows that while there has always proportionately been more black prisoners than white, the ratio of black prisoners to whites rose between 1900 and 1970, but has fallen since 1990. The reverse of what should be the case if mass incarceration marked the resurrection of Jim Crow. What has risen dramatically since the 1970s is the incarceration rate among high school dropouts, effectively working class and poor, while the rate among college graduates, black and white, has declined. As the study notes, in 2017, a white high school dropout was about 15 times more likely to be in prison than a black college graduate. Again, this is a story about class and about the policing of the poor as much as it is about race. To suggest that is not to deny racism or to fall into the trap of class reductionism, as some suggest. It is simply not to wish away the complexities of the world. Without facing up to those complexities, it becomes impossible to fashion a strategy whether to oppose racism or to defend working class interests. The other side of the white privilege claim is the embrace of white identity, the insistence that all white people have a common identity and set of interests. It has become a means of rebranding racism in identitarian terms. The same trends that transformed 60s social movements into the contemporary politics of identity have also driven the rehabilitation of white identity. The same economic and social changes, the same loss of power of working class communities and working class organisations, and so on. The marginalisation of the working class is largely the product of economic and social changes, but many have come to see it primarily as a cultural loss. The very decline of the economic and political power of the working class has helped obscure the economic and political roots of social problems. And as culture has become the medium through which social issues are refracted, so many within the working class have come to see their problems in cultural terms. They too have turned to the language of identity to express their discontent. The language of class has given way to the language of culture, or rather class itself has come to be seen not as a political, but as a cultural, even racial attribute. Where once racism expressed itself through the perception of the working class as distinct, racially distinct, and as non-white, today it is often expressed through the promotion of ideas about the white working class, where whiteness seems more important than the fact of them being working class. And all this has opened the door to the identity movements of the far right, which link a reactionary politics of identity rooted in hostility to migrants and Muslims to economic and social policies that once were the staple of the left, a defence of jobs, support for the welfare state, opposition to austerity, and so on. The problem, though, is not simply the far right. It is also the way that far-right themes have steeped into the mainstream in the embrace of identity. Far-right tropes such as the Great Replacement theory, a conspiracy theory about the elites replacing indigenous Europeans with immigrants, and call to resist the loss of the European homeland has now become common currency among mainstream conservative discussions. The American novelist Lionel Shriver, for instance, fears a de-whitening of London and projects her own version of replacement theory. The lineages of white Britons in their homeland go back hundreds of years, she wrote in The Spectator, and yet they have had to submissively accept the ethnic transformation of the UK without a peep of protest. Westerners, she adds, are being forced, and I quote, to passively accept and even abet incursions by foreigners so massive that the native-born are effectively surrendering their territory without a shot fired. Or consider this. Europe is committing suicide. By the end of the lifespans of most people currently alive, Europe will not be Europe, and the peoples of Europe will have lost the only place in the world we had to call home. Not Marine Le Pen or Tommy Robinson, but Douglas Murray, associate editor of The Spectator, one of Britain's best-known conservative writers, a former Holyoake lecturer, in the opening to his bestseller, The Strange Death of Europe. Murray worries too about, quote, the replacement of large parts of European populations by other peoples, and fears that, quote, London has become a foreign country because in 23 of London's 33 boroughs, white Britons are now in a minority. The irony is that Murray and Shriver, like many conservatives, are fierce critics of identity politics, except when their identity happens to be white, and the problem is that of white decline. The mainstreaming of identity politics by the left has allowed conservatives to give racism a new legitimacy by normalising white identity, while at the same time criticising the very politics that they are embracing. So just to recap the argument, the concept of race emerged in the 18th century as the medium through which could be understood many of the contradictions of modernity. Most importantly, it made sense of and provided a justification for the persistence of inequalities and enslavement in societies that had proclaimed their fidelity to equality. The most cogent, deep-seated, far-reaching challenge to the concept of race came through the radical universalist tradition, a tradition that confronted both racism and the racialization of people, that is, both the practice of discrimination and the imposition of racial categories on people, often as a means of justifying such discrimination. The erosion of that tradition has created a space that has now come to be filled by the politics of identity. Human beings live neither in the particular nor in the universal. We use these terms, but we don't live in either of them specifically. All humans define themselves through their many rooted identities. A woman, an engineer, a Parisian, a Jew, a FC Barcelona fan, a devourer of Satyajit Ray films. And also in terms of more universal aspirations. Those aspirations are framed by the character of politics and that of social engagement. Humanity manifests itself in concrete local forms. And these are the starting points for understanding the more abstract concepts of human universality. Equally, it is the more universal sense of being human that gives up rooted local forms and identities, context and meaning. What links the particular and the universal is conscious activity through which humans make and remake their world through politics and art and social struggles. These allow us to transcend our immediate local identities and to reach out and discover more universal forms of our humanness. from the Haitian Revolution to the suffragette movement, from hosting Ukrainian refugees to campaigning for the Uyghurs in China. Our engagement with the world allows us to move beyond our immediate concerns and to place those concerns in a more expansive, more universal context. The opposite is also true. When politics seems frayed and social movements have disintegrated, the link between the local and the global, between the particular and the universal, becomes strained, even broken. Race, as the historian Ivan Hannaford has noted, is a way of marginalising the political, of insisting that rights, duties, and obligations flow not from one's beliefs and actions, but from one's being, whether that is rooted in biology or history. Or as Fanon put it, to go back to Frantz Fanon, my black skin is not the wrapping of specific values. His solidarity, he wrote, is not with those who shared his race or his identity, but with all those who share his ideals and defend the rights and dignity of all peoples. Every time a man has contributed to the victory of the dignity of the spirit, he insisted, every time a man has said no to an attempt to subjugate his fellows, I have felt solidarity with that act. To transcend race, to break the bounds of identity politics, requires us to resurrect that sense of radical universalism, not just as an idea, but also as social movements. Thank you.
I want to do the reason why we're here tonight, which is to present Kenan with the Holyoake Lecture Medal. This medal is given in recognition of decades of work promoting humanist universalist values and providing a historically literate account of some of the most salient issues and debates in contemporary society. So, to Kenan, this is Kenan, this is you.